Almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drug water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park. They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. What if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Well, that's a pretty good video overall. It's got some important information and some things that we should all consider. I think one of the things that I'd like to start with is there's no definition of what an addiction is. Dictionary definitions and clinical definitions vary. They're often quite complex, and I've spent 41 years as a holistic health practitioner and therapist, and I would say probably 85% of my patients and clients are dealing with some kind of addiction and sometimes multiple addictions. And having researched this and developed a course on it myself, I worked to define an addiction, and what I came up with is that an addiction is any repeated behavior that does not produce the results you want. Here he's talking about rats in a cage with heroin water versus water, and most of that concept that video is based on is what's classically referred to as chemical addiction. But people get addicted to work, they get addicted to sex, they get addicted to stress, they get addicted to food, they get addicted to gossip, they get addicted to picking at their skin, they get addicted to, almost anything that is a coping strategy as a means of alleviating stress. A lot of these addictions Jung would call a neurosis, and Jung said that a neurosis is actually a very important process of healing, because without a neurosis to vent or dissipate the bottled up stress that people have in them, most people would commit suicide. So my first point is an addiction is any repeated behavior that does not produce the results you want. He spoke about isolation, and a lot of the people that have addictions do have issues of isolation, but we need to look at why do people isolate themselves? Well, if you look at what's called attachment theory, which is research particularly on how children bond with their mother and father in the first 2 years of life, about 50% of people have what's called a secure attachment, and the other 50% have attachment syndromes that are compensations. One of those types of syndromes is called an avoidant attachment, and that comes when a child can't get its needs met by reaching out to mother and asking for help or expressing the need for help, and parents are often too busy or distracted. So in the avoidant attachment, or by the way, if the parents are arguing and fighting, the child figures out that if it disappears and isolates itself, it's actually more likely to be able to meet its own needs in its own way. And so that is the beginning for many children of a life of progressively isolating themselves. And so when these people grow up and get into relationships like boyfriend, girlfriend, or have challenges at work or spousal challenges, they will isolate themselves and make themselves unavailable. One of the most common things that leads to divorces is one of the spouses, often men, just not being available, being withdrawn and pulled into themselves, which often is a symptom of an avoidant attachment. So a lot of this isolation actually is a byproduct of parenting environments that are not conducive to a secure attachment, which means the child feels safe and secure in the presence of mom and dad and bonds to them and has a sense of love, connection, and value, and feeling wanted, which is feeling loved. Another issue that leads to addiction is unhealed or unresolved personal and family trauma, which most of us are familiar with. Now, he's talking about how the research was redone so that there was more in the environment than just water and heroin water. And there we can look at the issues of chemical addiction, but we need to look at the fact that it is very, very well known. All you got to do is look at the World Economic Forum's published literature. If you look at what the geneticists and the globalists are doing and what they've been planning and executing now for over 100 years, it includes flooding the public with chemical hooks in the form of addictive foods. Many of you may be aware that food manufacturers can spend millions of dollars to make food addictive. A famous one is the Oreo cookie, which apparently the company that makes Oreo cookies spent millions of dollars carefully researching to make those cookies so addictive that people couldn't just eat one. They would eat the whole bag, and on it goes. So if you study food additives, preservatives, colorings, emulsifiers, stabilizers, and other ingredients, many of these things turn out to be inflammatory. They turn out to be neurotoxic. If you study neurotoxins, there's a whole bunch of them in food. Monosodium glutamate is an example. And so these things trigger chemical hooks. They draw you in. They often mess with the apostat center in the brain. And just like heroin or cocaine or alcohol, that leads to chemical addiction, and that leads to a lot of knock-on side effects such as obesity or eating disorders of a variety of type. It causes psychological challenges, distortions of a person's self-image, all of things which lead to repeated behaviors that do not produce the results people want. What I've found is that all addictions are ultimately, as a general broad sweep, attempts to get safe love. No bottle ever complains about how you kiss it, neither does a cigarette. So what we often find is people with unresolved trauma that don't have the skills or the support to heal it seek out safe love, and often these forms of safe love are things like sugar or various drugs, marijuana, alcohol, etc., that create what is classically called a state shift. It changes your biochemistry and gives you a state shift. So some of these things like marijuana have adaptogenic properties, which means they help people handle stress. So they serve to mediate the stress and help people handle it, but they often become addictions because the issue behind the addiction is not getting addressed. So one of the things we have to look at is our willingness to love ourselves. A lot of us had challenging childhoods and sometimes don't realize that the abandonment that we get from our parents actually serves the function to facilitate individuation into an adult. And if we don't understand that the abandonment, if reframed, can be used as a way of seeing that we were in an environment that facilitates our becoming self-sufficient as an adult and meeting our own needs, then we actually can stay stuck in the child archetype or the victim archetype. And if we stay stuck in those archetypes, then we're always, again, looking for a way to medicate ourselves, which opens the door for addiction. We also need to be conscious of the fact that a lot of addictions are the side effect of nutritional deficiencies, and there's many, many books written on that. For example, Nutrition in Your Mind, I believe, it's a long time since I read it, maybe George Wallace, but I have several books on that. And when you don't have adequate nutrition, then the cravings for the nutrition, be it minerals, trace minerals, vitamins, enzymes, etc., gets cross-wired in the brain because most of us don't have enough nutritional knowledge to know what the body's craving. And so it ends up being a craving for more cookies or more coffee or more sweet stuff or more drugs. And that's another factor. And we have a serious problem with malnutrition worldwide, as you can see by the levels of obesity and people that are overweight, and the fact that most food is nutritionally void. Fast food, look at Super Size Me documentary is just one of many such examples. So the other issue is that we have a very toxic environment. We've got issues of food system being poisoned. We've got only 4 to 6% of the food grown worldwide, including animals, is organic. So we're bringing on massive amounts of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, glyphosate, all of which have devastating effects on hormonal balance, on your organs of detoxification, your brain, your nervous system, pretty much global catastrophes depending on which chemical it is. And when we get enough toxic burden, it disrupts the harmony of our internal systems. Mercury poisoning, for example, can cause neural entanglement, and that leads to all sorts of confused information processing in the body, and the outcome of that, simply put, is a lot of addiction. And we also have huge problems with addiction to medical drugs and the chemical effects and the toxicity of those. Last time I researched it, I found 85%, and this was about 15 years ago, 85% of all Americans were on at least one prescribed medical drug, and I know it's much higher than that now. And it's also important to all of us to remember that we have instincts that guide us, but if we don't listen to our instincts, then we end up making bad decisions. And Carl Jung says that one of the instincts that humans have is creativity, and we also have imagination. So whenever we're facing challenges in life, be it the feeling of isolation or finding ourselves in a codependent relationship with exercise, food, drugs, sex, it's often a chance to remind us that we need to be more creative. We need to allow the childlike nature of us to rise up and be more imaginative and more spontaneous. And we often need to look carefully at the relationships that we're maintaining, because misery loves company. So people that are addicts are often hanging out with a lot of other people that are addicts. People that are suffering from a lot of back pain often end up finding themselves socializing with people with back pain. Doctors hang out with doctors. Lawyers hang out with lawyers. Billionaires hang out with billionaires. So like attracts like. So sometimes we have to pay more attention to the relationships we're maintaining and have a clear dream for ourselves. Psychologist Jerry Wesh says if you have a big enough dream, you don't need a crisis. And I think that's very, very important to really meditate on. So in the way I teach my patients and my students is we start with identifying what is it that you love enough to heal, grow, and change for. And I think if we don't have something bigger than us to grow into, then our compass loses its north, and we can easily get distracted and find ourselves having these temporary little love affairs with addicting substances and addicting people and addicting activities such as pornography. So thank you for the video. I just felt that this is such an important topic that I would share what I've learned in summary from 41 years as a therapist and working with countless addictions and looking at the realities of addiction and what really causes it. And for those of you that are interested, you can go to chekinstitute.com. I have an online training program called Overcoming Addiction, Obesity, and Disease that you might find very helpful, and it shows you how to explore these things and gives you some tools you can use. So many blessings to all of you. We're in a challenging world, but it's up to us to change it. And having a dream bigger than yourself gives you a reason to love yourself, cultivate relationships that are dream affirmative, have core values for at least what is happy making for you, how you're going to move your body, how you're going to eat, and what you're going to do for rest and introspection, so you have time inside of yourself each day. And when you have those 4 doctors in place, you're far less likely to fall into the trap of addiction. So lots of love.